4 minutes into the 1958 World Cup final, Brazil was losing. Sweden had scored first. For another team, it might have been only one goal. For Brazil, it carried the weight of 8 years of humiliation. The memory of losing the 1950 World Cup at home had never completely disappeared. And now, in another final against another host nation, Brazil was behind again. Some players wanted the game restarted immediately, but one man did something strange. Didi walked toward the goal. He picked up the ball. He placed it under his arm, and instead of running back toward the center circle, he began to walk, slowly, almost casually. His teammates could not understand it. Zagallo rushed toward him, desperate for him to hurry, but Didi appeared completely calm. Brazil, he believed, was the better team. There was time. There would be goals. 5 minutes after Sweden's opener, Brazil equalized. By the end, they had scored 5. Pelé produced moments the world would never forget. Garrincha tormented defenders. Vava scored twice, and Brazil became world champion for the first time. History would eventually turn Pelé into the greatest symbol of Brazilian football, and deservedly so. But in Sweden, in 1958, the player recognized as the tournament's finest was not the 17-year-old Pelé. It was Didi, the midfielder who controlled the rhythm, the man who passed before others could see the opening, the player whose most famous shot seemed to float gently through the air before suddenly falling toward the earth. They called it the Folha Seca, the dry leaf. And perhaps no image describes Didi better. Elegant, quiet, almost effortless. Until, at exactly the right moment, everything changed direction. Before the world knew the king, Brazil already had its prince. This is the story of Didi, the forgotten genius behind Brazil's first World Cup. Long before the great stadiums and World Cup finals, Waldir Pereira was a boy in Campos dos Goitacazes, north of Rio de Janeiro. He was born there in 1928. His family had little money. Football did not require much. A ball, a patch of ground, a group of children willing to play until darkness made the game impossible. But when Didi was 14, football nearly disappeared from his life completely. During a game with friends, he injured his leg. The wound became badly infected. The situation grew so serious that doctors came close to amputating it. For months, the future footballer could not even walk normally. FIFA's account of his life says he spent around 6 months in a wheelchair before recovering. Think about what that meant. The same leg that might have been removed would eventually help change the way a football could move through the air. But there was no guarantee of any of that yet. Didi simply returned to playing. He and his brother Dodo played amateur football for Rio Branco in their hometown. Then an unexpected opportunity appeared. Madureira, a club from Rio de Janeiro's top level, became interested in Dodo. His brother traveled to Rio, and Didi went with him. But football has a strange way of rearranging plans. The club began noticing the younger brother who had come along to help. Didi was given his own chance. Soon, Madureira signed him. Dodo would eventually leave. Didi stayed. His journey toward the center of Brazilian football had begun almost by accident. And already, a pattern was appearing. An injury that should have ended everything became part of his beginning. A trip meant to help his brother became Didi's opportunity. Again and again, his career would turn in unexpected directions, much like the ball from his right foot would do years later. By the end of the 1940s, Didi had reached Fluminense. Now he was playing in Rio de Janeiro, one of the great centers of Brazilian football. And his timing was remarkable. Brazil was preparing to host the 1950 World Cup. For the tournament, Rio was building something enormous, the Maracanã, a stadium intended not simply for football matches, but for national spectacle. Before the World Cup began, the unfinished giant hosted its inaugural match. A selection of players from Rio faced a selection from São Paulo. The first player ever to score inside the Maracanã was Didi. It should have been a perfect beginning to a new Brazilian football age. Instead, the stadium would soon become associated with the country's deepest sporting wound. Brazil reached the decisive match of the 1950 World Cup against Uruguay, needing only a draw to become champion. Nearly everyone expected celebration. Instead, Uruguay won. The Maracanã fell silent. Didi had not been part of Brazil's World Cup squad, but like every Brazilian footballer of his generation, he would spend the following years playing beneath the shadow of that defeat. His own reputation, however, continued to grow. With Fluminense, he won major honors, including the Rio State Championship and the International Copa Rio tournament in 1952. His intelligence was becoming impossible to ignore. Didi was not the kind of midfielder who needed to sprint constantly to control a match. He controlled space. He controlled timing. He could receive the ball, lift his head, and make a pass that changed the entire direction of an attack. Brazil took him to the 1954 World Cup in Switzerland. There, another powerful European team stopped them. Hungary defeated Brazil 4-2 in a brutal quarterfinal remembered as the Battle of Bern. Another World Cup was gone. Another European opponent had ended Brazil's dream. By then, Didi was no longer the unknown boy from Campos. He was entering his prime. But Brazil was still searching for something. Talent had never been the problem. The question was whether talent could learn how to win. One of Didi's greatest weapons was created because, once again, his body failed him. He injured his ankle while playing against America. After rest and treatment, striking the ball normally caused pain. So he experimented. Instead of kicking in the usual way, Didi began contacting the ball with 3 toes. The pain was reduced, but something else happened. The ball behaved strangely. It traveled forward and then suddenly dipped or changed direction. Didi understood immediately that the accident could become a weapon. He began practicing the technique relentlessly, morning after morning, afternoon after afternoon, until the strange flight of the ball became something he could control. Brazilians gave the shot a beautiful name: Folha Seca, the dry leaf. Imagine a leaf falling from a tree. For a moment, it appears to drift calmly. Then the air catches it. It drops, turns, changes direction. A goalkeeper watching Didi's free kick experienced something similar. The ball appeared predictable until suddenly it was not. The technique became one of his signatures and an ancestor of the modern knuckleball-style free kick. Then, in 1957, Brazil needed it desperately. Brazil faced Peru in qualification for the 1958 World Cup. The first match had ended in a draw. In Rio, Brazil needed victory. The game remained scoreless. Then, Didi stood over a free kick. The ball rose, moved, dropped. Goal. Brazil won 1-0. That single Folha Seca helped send the national team to Sweden. There was an irony in it. The man who had nearly lost a leg as a teenager had now used another injury to invent the technique that helped take Brazil to the World Cup. Yet even after delivering qualification, his place was not completely secure. Didi was approaching 30. Some questioned whether an older midfielder could handle the physical demands of the tournament. His response was wonderfully simple. Brazil was discussing whether to leave behind the man who had effectively bought their ticket to Sweden. They took him, and football history changed.
Brazil arrived in Sweden with extraordinary talent, but talent had traveled to World Cups before. What Brazil also carried was memory. 1950 remained a national wound. 1954 had ended in frustration and violence. The team needed more than skill. It needed control. Brazil opened the tournament by defeating Austria 3-0. Then came England. For the first time in World Cup history, a match finished without a goal, 0-0. For Brazil, it was an uncomfortable result. The final group match would be against the Soviet Union. This was not an opponent Brazil wanted to face, with uncertainty spreading through the squad. The Soviets were disciplined, powerful, and physically imposing. Their goalkeeper was Lev Yashin, already establishing himself as one of football's great figures. Didi understood the danger, but he also saw another problem. Brazil possessed astonishing attacking talent that was not yet fully being used. Garrincha had not started the first two matches. Neither had 17-year-old Pele. Inside the Brazilian camp, experienced players began pressing for changes. According to FIFA's account, Didi, Nilton Santos, and Captain Bellini approached coach Vicente Feola. They wanted Zito in midfield. They wanted Garrincha, and they wanted Pele. For an era in which players rarely challenged the decisions of authority, it was an extraordinary intervention. Feola agreed. The change gave Didi something crucial: freedom. With Zito providing greater defensive balance beside him, Didi could move the game forward. Ahead were Garrincha, Pele, Vavá, and Zagallo. Brazil was about to discover the shape of a team that could terrify the world, and Didi would become the man connecting its pieces.
The match against the Soviet Union began at extraordinary speed. Garrincha immediately attacked. Pele hit the post. Within minutes, the Soviet defense was under pressure. Vavá scored. Brazil eventually won 2-0. The score did not completely describe what had happened. Something had clicked. The team had found balance between discipline and improvisation, and sitting at the center of it was Didi. To understand his importance, do not imagine a modern midfielder simply accumulating passes. Didi changed the speed of matches. If Brazil needed patience, he slowed the ball. If a winger found space, he could switch the attack with one long pass. If defenders moved toward Pele, Didi could find Garrincha. If Garrincha pulled opponents wide, another route opened through the middle. The attackers provided the explosion. Didi often provided the match. Pele would later describe playing football for Didi as something almost effortless, as easy as peeling an orange. That ease was deceptive. Great playmakers often appear slow because they have already made their decision before everyone else. Didi did not need to chase the match. He seemed to wait for it to reveal itself. Brazil finished first in the group without conceding a goal, but winning the group meant little if the old World Cup story repeated itself. Next came Wales in the quarterfinal. The match was difficult. Wales defended stubbornly. Space disappeared. Brazil needed one moment. Didi moved forward and headed the ball toward Pele. The 17-year-old controlled it, escaped his defender, and scored 1-0. Pele's first World Cup goal. It was the beginning of one of football's greatest individual World Cup stories. And look carefully at where that beginning came from. A ball from Didi. History was starting to shift toward Pele, but Didi was still helping to point it there. The semi-final brought Brazil face-to-face with France, and France had the most dangerous scorer in the tournament, just Fontaine. Brazil struck first through Vavá. Fontaine quickly equalized. For a moment, the match was balanced. Then, Didi stepped forward. In the 39th minute, he scored. Brazil led 2-1. After the break came the explosion. Pelé scored once, then again, then a third time. A 17-year-old had scored a World Cup semi-final hat-trick. Brazil won 5-2. The world was watching a phenomenon emerge. And this is where Didi's historical problem begins. He was reaching the peak of his greatness at exactly the moment football discovered someone even more extraordinary. Most players become legends because history gives them a stage. Didi helped construct a stage on which Pele became immortal. That does not reduce Pele's achievement. It makes Didi's role more interesting. The Brazilian attack had different forms of genius. Garrincha could destroy defensive structure through dribbling. Pele could create goals from almost nothing. Vavá attacked the penalty area. Zagallo gave the team tactical balance from the left. And Didi connected them. He was the organizer inside the orchestra. Not always the loudest instrument, but often the one deciding the tempo. Brazil had now reached another World Cup final. Their opponent would be Sweden, the hosts. Once again, Brazil would face a European nation in a decisive World Cup match. Once again, a stadium full of home supporters would watch them. Once again, the memory of 1950 would be impossible to completely ignore. Brazil had the talent to become world champion. What nobody knew was how they would react when something went wrong. They would not have to wait long to find out. If sweating is excessive or sudden, that could be hyperhidrosis, and talking to a doctor is a good idea.
June 29th, 1958, Rasunda Stadium. Brazil against Sweden. 4 minutes. Niels Lidholm scored. Sweden 1, Brazil 0. For the home crowd, it was the perfect beginning. For Brazil, it was the nightmare returning. Host nation, a World Cup final. Brazil behind. This is where we return to the image from the beginning. Didi walked into the goal, he picked up the ball, he placed it under his arm, and he walked toward the center. Zagallo wanted him to hurry. Didi did the opposite. His message was simple: do not panic. We are better than this. 5 minutes later, Garrincha attacked down the right and delivered the ball into the area. Vavá scored. 1-1. Later, almost the same pattern appeared again. Garrincha, cross, Vavá, 2-1. The fear disappeared. Then came Pele. A ball arrived in the penalty area. He lifted it over a defender, moved around him, and finished. 3-1. Zagallo made it 4. Sweden pulled one back. Then, in the final moments, Pele scored again. Brazil 5, Sweden 2. For the first time, Brazil was world champion. Bellini lifted the trophy. Pele, only 17, cried after the final whistle. The photographs would become part of football mythology. Pele would eventually win 3 World Cups and become the game's first truly global superstar. But when the 1958 tournament was assessed, Didi was named its best player, ahead of Pele, ahead of Garrincha, ahead even of Fontaine, who scored 13 goals. Why? Because goals reveal only part of a football match. Didi had given Brazil rhythm. He had given the forwards service. He had given the midfield intelligence. And in the most dangerous psychological moment of the final, he had given the team calm. The boy who nearly lost his leg had become world champion. The strange shot created because kicking hurt had helped Brazil reach Sweden. The falling leaf had completed its journey, and the country that had spent 8 years trying to escape the memory of defeat finally had a different memory. Brazil was no longer the nation that almost won. Brazil was world champion. If sweating is excessive or sudden, possible hyperhidrosis, it's best to see a doctor. After Sweden, Didi's reputation crossed the Atlantic. European newspapers had called him Mr. Football. Real Madrid signed him in 1959. Consider the dressing room he entered: Alfredo Di Stefano, Ferenc Puskás, Paco Gento, a club in the middle of an unprecedented era of European domination. Didi spent 1 season in Madrid and was part of the squad that completed the club's 5th consecutive European Cup triumph. But his European chapter was brief. His football was admired. His fit inside a team already built around enormous personalities was more complicated. Soon, Didi returned to Brazil. It would have been easy for history to treat 1958 as his ending. It was not. 4 years later, he traveled to another World Cup, Chile, 1962. Didi was now 33. Pele was no longer the unknown teenager. Brazil entered as defending champion. Then Pele was injured early in the tournament and could not continue. The team had to adapt. Garrincha became its most spectacular attacking force, but the older generation remained essential. Didi was still there, still controlling, still distributing, still reading the match. Brazil reached the final and defeated Czechoslovakia 3-1. World champions again. Didi now had 2 World Cups. His career linked different stages of Brazilian football. He had played before Pelé became Pelé. He helped introduce Pelé to the World Cup. And he was still present when Brazil proved the 1958 victory had not been an accident. The dynasty had begun. Brazil would eventually become associated with an endless line of attacking geniuses. But before the image of Brazilian football was fully formed for the world, Didi had helped define one of its most important qualities: beauty with purpose, technique that solved problems, elegance that still won. If sweating is excessive or sudden, possible hyperhidrosis, please consult a doctor.
Didi eventually stopped playing, but he did not stop teaching football. His most remarkable chapter came far from Brazil, in Peru. He coached Sporting Cristal and won the Peruvian championship. Then he took charge of the national team. Peru had never qualified for a World Cup through the qualification process. Under Didi, they reached Mexico in 1970. They even qualified at Argentina's expense. At the tournament, Peru reached the quarterfinals. Their opponent was Brazil. The country Didi had once led from midfield now defeated the team he had helped build from the bench. Brazil won 4-2 and continued toward another world title. Pelé lifted his 3rd World Cup. Didi's former pupil Teófilo Cubillas would later describe him as a second father and credit him with improving his shooting, free kicks, and ability with both feet. That may be the clearest expression of Didi's legacy. He did not simply perform football. He understood it. Didi died in 2001, aged 72. By then, Pelé's name belonged to the entire world. Garrincha had become a symbol of Brazilian joy and tragedy. Later generations knew Zico, Romario, Ronaldo, Ronaldinho, and countless others. Didi's name became quieter. But being remembered less does not mean mattering less. Go back to that final in Sweden. 4 minutes. Brazil is losing. The old fear is returning. One player retrieves the ball. Everyone else wants to rush. He walks. That moment contains almost everything that made Didi special. Control when others felt pressure. Vision when others saw danger. Confidence without spectacle. Like his Folha Seca, his genius did not always announce itself loudly. It traveled quietly, then changed direction, and by the time everyone understood what had happened, the game was different. Perhaps that is why Didi deserves to be remembered. Not as the man who came before Pelé, and not as a forgotten rival to him, but as one of the men who created the conditions in which Brazil became Brazil. Pelé became the king, but in 1958, the prince helped build the kingdom.